Hello and welcome back to another installment of Schnee Reads Call of the Wild. This is assignment 14, chapter 6, part 2. So as always, our standards, we are looking at the things in the novel that reveal aspects of Buck's character, specifically around the theme of Buck becoming wilder throughout the story. However, in this section, he is continuing to suppress those wild instincts in order to stay with John Thornton because he loved him. In this section, we are going to specifically look at imagery, specifically with regards to the sled pulling scene. If you remember, imagery is where an author writes and describes things that would appeal to the five senses. So taste, touch, smell, sight, and sound. Students will analyze how Buck has changed since the start of the novel. In order to do that, you will probably need to summarize how he was at the beginning of the novel. You should be using specific details, but you don't have to go back and find quotes. Show how he develops throughout the novel, summarizing things, and then use some quotes from this last section to show us how he has really changed before becoming this wild creature that will happen by the end of the book. All right, so what happened last time? If you remember, Buck begins a long period of healing with John Thornton. They are both injured and rest and bond together at this time. This man wants nothing from Buck at all except to see him safe and happy. Because of this, Buck learns to truly love a person for the first time in his life. We meet John's dogs, Skeet and Nig. These dogs just want to be friendly. There's no spirit of competition or jealousy. This is the first time all dogs are living on an equal level. Buck also learns to respect the other men in Thornton's camp, Pete and Hans, and he does this because Thornton respects them. Because of this love and this respect, Buck suppresses these wild natural instincts like stealing to survive and fighting with other dogs, which have developed in him over time. However, they are still under the surface, and Buck kind of changes in a way that instead of being out to protect himself, he is now out to protect Thornton. So he uses these wild instincts to protect this man that he cares about. Because of this, he puts himself in danger multiple times, either when Thornton tests him by asking him to jump off the cliff, when Buck attacks the man in the bar who attacks Thornton, or by putting himself in danger by saving Thornton from a raging river. All of these situations show that Buck has evolved and developed, and he's using those old, instincts to protect another person that he cares about. All right, we're going to watch this video about how dogs learn to trust and some other doggy superpowers that are out there. The video is a little lengthy. It's about 9 minutes. But that being said, feel free to sit back, relax, enjoy, watch. It's really interesting. These are all scientific ways that dogs have these kind of fun superpowers that humans have come to use, especially in the field of crime fighting or, medical advancements, things like that. And these are all those instincts that are inherent in dogs that Buck would have used to learn to trust Thornton and Hans and Pete. I cannot stress this enough. Please do not try these experiments with dogs that you don't know. All right? If you see a dog in the street and you don't know it, avoid it.
Science confirms that dogs can recognize a bad person. We all love our pets and consider them the smartest, kindest, cutest, most loyal, and the list of top-notch qualities goes on and on. It looks like dog owners have scientific evidence to prove that their pets are the most perceptive and can even help them single out bad people. But dogs aren't just natural-born detectives. Their list of superpowers goes beyond letting you know whether or not you can trust someone. Stick around till the end of the video as we dig up the dirt on your dog's incredible abilities. But first, take this moment to subscribe to our channel and turn on post notifications so that you'll never miss an update from us again. Dogs can recognize a bad person. A team led by Dr. Akiko Takaoka from the Department of Psychology at Japan's Kyoto University conducted a study, the results of which were published in Animal Cognition Journal in March 2015, to find out if a dog would trust a person who lied to it. The experiment went like this. Dog owners would first point to a container with food in it, and the dog would run to it. They would then trick their dog into approaching a container without food simply by pointing to it. This comes as no surprise, of course, since we know that dogs usually run to wherever their owners point at. In fact, because of this, scientists are sure that canines understand human gestures. But when the gestures are inconsistent, the dog can become nervous and stressed. The third time around, the dogs would not follow the pointing hand. They simply didn't believe the liars. All of the 34 dogs that took part in the experiment showed the same results. What this means is that the dogs were using their previous bad experience to know that a person was untrustworthy. Attaboy, pup. Don't let them fool you. The group of scientists claims that the research has a potential implication in the behavioral study of canines. It also tells us that dogs prefer this world to be certain, according to animal behavior expert Dr. John Bradshaw of the University of Bristol. As for Dr. Takaoka, she plans to do the experiment on wolves since they're the closest relative to dogs. They feel how other people treat their owners. One more study, published in Neuroscience and Biobehavioral Reviews, states that dogs clearly read the communication between their owners and strangers. In the experiment, researchers at Kyoto University had dog owners ask two groups of strangers for a little help. One was supposed to agree, while the other was told to rudely decline. Afterwards, the strangers tried to give the pups a treat, and the doggos surprised us yet again. They wouldn't take a treat from the people who'd been mean or disrespectful towards their owners. In fact, besides distrusting them, they flat out ignored these meanies. They preferred to be fed by those who'd helped and actually showed kindness towards these people as if they were reciprocating the gesture. Thus, the canines showed a good understanding of social etiquette. These experiments prove that dogs can feel how others interact with their owners and draw their own conclusions on how to treat those people. Dogs can read our body language and emotions. It's been proven time and time again that dogs are able to read our gestures and facial expressions. Scientists at the Messerli Research Institute's Clever Dog Lab in Vienna managed to teach dogs the difference between sad and happy faces. With enough training and treats for a job well done, the pooches were eventually able to tell the happy faces from the sad ones, even with human faces they didn't come across during their training. It means they actually learned to recognize emotions by judging facial expressions. You're probably wondering, how did the animals show their choice? They simply touched the right picture with their nose. They can sense fear. Don't let it know you're afraid, otherwise it will definitely attack you. This is the sort of catchphrase told to people who are afraid of dogs. But this isn't just some urban legend. Researchers at Liverpool University took it from a popular belief to a popular belief backed up by science. In a study of 694 people, the scientists found a link between a person's emotional state and their likelihood of getting bitten. Emotionally stable and confident people didn't get bitten nearly as often as those who feel anxious around intimidating dogs. How is it possible? Well, dogs might not have psychic powers to read the fear in your mind, but they do have a very keen sense of smell. With their super sensitive noses, they can detect the chemical reactions going on in our body when we're stressed. The most obvious of those would be sweating and releasing adrenaline. As our blood starts pumping faster from fear, we start emitting pheromones that spread all around. Plus, as we already know by now, dogs are great at reading facial expressions. You're probably not going to be grinning from ear to ear as you're trembling in fear, are you? So if you don't fancy sharp teeth piercing your limb, don't freak out the next time you see a Doberman rushing in your direction. Plus, it might just want to say hello. The research also claims that insecure dog owners tend to pass on that feature to their own canine companions. Their final conclusion was that dogs tend to bite dog owners more often than people who don't have a pooch.
No way!
What else can dogs sense with their incredibly sharp noses? You've probably heard about their ability to predict weather changes and earthquakes, but what about detecting serious illnesses? Dogs can smell cancer. Lots of dog owners have reported that their pets paid particular attention to their body part affected by cancer. The most common types of cancer they can detect are breast and colon cancer. In case this doesn't sound very true to you, there's scientific evidence to back it up. Dr. Hilary Brody, a professor in the Department of Otolaryngology at the University of California, Davis, claims that dogs can find the cancer-affected tissues out of dozens of samples. Cancerous cells have a specific smell that doesn't exist in healthy tissues. There's even a special organization in the UK called Medical Detection Dogs, with 8 powerful sniffers that analyze urine samples for cancer. The organization's CEO was actually saved by her own Labrador, who kept staring and lunging at her chest. This ended up helping her find breast cancer at a very early stage, and she was cured of it. Scientists believe it'd take about 6 months of training for a dog to be able to recognize the sense of specific cancer types. They can warn of upcoming epileptic seizures and diabetic shock. People with insulin-dependent diabetes must control their blood glucose levels since they can change dramatically and suddenly drop to dangerous levels. Sounds pretty scary, huh? But alas, looks like dogs can come to the rescue in this situation too. Their super noses can sense the rapid changes in blood sugar levels since they change the smell of an affected person's breath and skin. Dogs for Diabetics has been training dogs to use their natural breath detectors since 2004. The students at this doggy medical school learn how to inform their owners of upcoming diabetic attacks. They can also help parents by warning them of upcoming attacks in their children. The same super senses let dogs predict seizures, and enough training teaches them to help a seizing person and even fetch a phone when it's needed. In a study published in the European Journal of Epilepsy, a group of scientists carried out an experiment in which they taught dogs to anticipate epileptic seizures by giving them treats each time their owner had a seizure. Who would have thought that an animal notorious for chasing its own tail was such a super genius? Dogs can sense serious diseases and save us from attacks. They can decipher our gestures and decide if they want to follow social cues. They can even decide to stop trusting and obeying you when you try to trick them. So if your dog doesn't like your friends, maybe there's something wrong in your friendships?
So as you saw in the video, dogs have a long history of having these kind of scientifically proven instinctual superpowers that we have come to know and appreciate in our lives. And John Thornton probably really came to know and appreciate in Buck, especially when Buck was able to sense danger and jump in and save him in many situations. So now that we have finished watching this video about doggy superpowers and trust, we're going to continue on to read chapter 6, part 2. And as always, you will be answering your Schoology quiz. And for this quiz, there is no multiple choice. So those of you who have been skating by not doing the short answers or have been, doing not the greatest job on the short answers, you're going to really need to focus and pay attention while you're reading and go back in the text and find the evidence that you need. Now we're continuing on with chapter 6, part 2, For the Love of a Man. That winter at Dawson, Buck performed another exploit, not so heroic perhaps, but one that put his name many notches higher on the totem pole of Alaskan fame. This exploit was particularly gratifying to the 3 men, for they stood in need of the outfit which it furnished, and were enabled to make a long-deserved trip into the Virgin East, where miners had not yet appeared. It was brought about by a conversation in the Eldorado saloon, in which men waxed boastful of their favorite dogs. Buck, because of his record, was the target for these men, and Thornton was driven stoutly to defend him. At the end of half an hour, one man stated that his dog could start a sled with 500 pounds and walk off with it. Second bragged 600 for his dog, and a third 700. So keep in mind, we said this before, when it says start a sled, it means to break it out of the ice and then pull it along. Pooh-pooh, said John Thornton. Buck can start 1,000 pounds. And break it out and walk off with it for 100 yards, demanding Matheson, a Bonanza king, he of the 700 vaunt. And break it out and walk it off for 100 yards, John Thornton said coolly. So this is much more than one dog typically pulls on a dog sled. Many dogs usually break up this weight of 1,000 pounds. And remember, 100 yards is 300 feet, because a yard is 3 feet, and 100 of them is 300. So this is probably, 3/5 of the length of a football field. Actually, no, further than that, because football fields are 1,000. So there you go. So now we're going to go on with the rest of chapter 6, part 2, for the love of a man. That winter at Dawson, Buck performed another exploit, not so heroic, perhaps, but one that put his name many notches higher on the totem pole of Alaskan fame. This exploit was particularly gratifying to the three men, for they stood in need of the outfit which it furnished, and were enabled to make a long-desired trip into the Virgin East, where miners had not yet appeared. It was brought about by a conversation in the El Dorado saloon, in which men waxed boastful of their favorite dogs. Buck, because of his record, was the target for these men, and Thornton was driven stoutly to defend him. At the end of half an hour, one man stated that his dog could start a sled with 500 pounds and walk off with it. A second bragged 600 for his dog, and a third 700. So remember, to start a sled means to break it out and to get it moving. And where they talk about the outfit that they were looking for, they're not talking about clothing. They're talking about they need money to buy the supplies that they need to go and explore further in the east where nobody has gone before. Oh, pooh-pooh, said John Thornton. Buck can start 1,000 pounds. And break it out and walk off with it for 100 yards, demanded Matheson, a bonanza king, he of the 700 vaunt. And break it out and walk it off for 100 yards, John Thornton said coolly. So remember, this is much more than one dog typically pulls on a dog sled. Usually, many dogs will break up this amount of weight. Also, keep in mind, 100 yards is 300 feet, which is a little bit less than a football field length. So Buck has to essentially pull a 1,000-pound sled by himself after breaking it out of the ice, the length of essentially a football field. Well, Matheson said slowly and deliberately, so that all could hear, I've got $1,000 that says he can't. And there it is. So saying, he slammed a sack of gold dust of the size of a bologna sausage down upon the bar. Nobody spoke. Thornton's bluff, if bluff it was, had been called. He could feel a flush of warm blood creeping up his face. His tongue had tricked him. He did not know whether Buck could start 1,000 pounds, half a ton. The enormousness of it appalled him, and he had great faith in Buck's strength and had often thought him capable of starting such a load, but never, as now, had he faced the possibility of it, the eyes of a dozen men fixed upon him, silent and waiting. Further, he had no $1,000, nor had Hans or Pete. So without proof of what Buck can do, Thornton is making this bet because he has faith in Buck's abilities and Buck's love for him. I've got a sled standing outside now with 20 50-pound sacks of flour on it, Matheson went on with brutal directness, so don't let that hinder you. Thornton did not reply. He did not know what to say. He glanced from face to face in the absent way of a man who has lost the power of thought and is seeking somewhere to find the thing that will start it going again. The face of Jim O'Brien, a Mastodon king, an old-time comrade, caught his eye. It was a cue to him, seeming to rouse him to do what he would never have dreamed of doing. Can you lend me 1,000? He asked, almost in a whisper. Sure, answered O'Brien, thumping down a plethoric sack by the side of Matheson's. Though it's little faith I'm having, John, that the beast can do the trick. The El Dorado emptied its occupants into the street to see the test. Tables were deserted, and the dealers and gamekeepers came forth to see the outcome of the wager and to lay odds. Several hundred men, furred and mittened, banked around the sled within easy distance. Matheson's sled, loaded with 1,000 pounds of flour, had been standing for a couple of hours in the intense cold. It was about 60 below zero. The runners had frozen fast to the hard-packed snow. Men offered odds of 2 to 1 that Buck could not budge the sled. A quibble arose concerning the phrase break out. O'Brien contended it was Thornton's privilege to knock the runners loose, leaving Buck to break it out from a dead standstill. Matheson insisted that the phrase included breaking the runners from the frozen grip of the stone. A majority of the men who had witnessed the making of the bet decided in his favor, whereat the odds went up to 3-1 against Buck. So there were no takers. Not a man believed him capable of the feat. John Thornton had been hurried into the wager, heavy with doubt, and now that he looked at the sled itself, the concrete fact, with the regular team of 10 dogs curled up in the snow before it, the more impossible the task appeared. Matheson waxed jubilant. 3-1, he proclaimed. I'll lay you another 1,000 at that figure, Thornton. What do you say? So basically, watching this, many people are betting against Buck because they feel that he can't do it, and only Thornton is the one backing his own dog. Keep in mind also the Matheson has now just kind of upped the bet to $2,000. If it's won, that's over $62,000 in today's money. All right. For many people, that's an entire yearly salary. Just to give you an idea of how much $2,000 would have been back in this day and what it would have meant to John Thornton and his crew. Thornton's doubt was strong in his face, but his fighting spirit was aroused. The fighting spirit that soars above odds, fails to recognize the impossible, and is deaf to all save the clamor for battle. He called Hans and Pete to him. Their sacks were slim, and with his own, the three partners could rake together only $200. In the ebb of the fortunes, this sum was their total capital, yet they had laid it unhesitatingly against Matheson's 600. So they basically bet all the money they have on Buck at this point. The team of 10 dogs was unhitched, and Buck, with his own harness, was put into the sled. He had caught the contagion of the excitement, and he felt that in some way he must do a great thing for John Thornton. Murmurs of admiration at his splendid appearance went up. He was in perfect condition, without an ounce of superfluous flesh, and the 150 pounds that he weighed were so many pounds of grit and virility. His furry coat shone with the sheen of silk. Down the neck and across the shoulders his mane, in repose as it was, half bristled, and seemed to lift with every movement, as though excess of vigor made each particular hair alive and active. The great breast and heavy forelegs were no more than a proportion with the rest of his body, where the muscles showed in tight rolls underneath the skin. Men felt these muscles and proclaimed them hard as iron, and the odds went down 2-1. So basically, Buck is in the best health of his life. He's all muscle. There's no fat on him at this point, and in essence, he's ready for this challenge. Gad, sir, gad, stuttered a member of the latest dynasty, a king of the skookum benches. I offer you 800 for him, sir, before the test, sir. 800 just as he stands. Thornton shook his head and stepped to Buck's side. You must stand off from him, Matheson protested. Free play and plenty of room. The crowd fell silent. Only could be heard the voices of the gamblers vainly offering 2-1. Everybody acknowledged Buck a magnificent animal. The 50-pound sacks of flour bulked too large in their eyes for them to loosen their pouch strings. Thornton knelt down by Buck's side. He took his head in his two hands and rested, cheek on cheek. He did not playfully shake him, as was his wont, or murmur soft love curses, but he whispered in his ear, "As you love me, Buck, as you love me," was what he whispered. Buck whined with suppressed eagerness. So Thornton basically plays on the idea that Buck loves him, and he basically just says to him, if you love me, you will make this happen. Pull for the love of me is basically what he's saying. The crowd was watching curiously. The affair was growing mysterious. It seemed like a conjuration, As Thornton got to his feet, Buck seized his midden hand between his jaws, pressing in with his teeth and releasing slowly, half reluctantly. It was the answer in terms not of speech but of love. Thornton stepped well back. "Now, Buck," he said. Buck tightened the traces and then slacked them for a matter of several inches. It was the way he had learned. "Gee!" Thornton's voice rang out, sharp in the tense silence. Buck swung to the right, ending the movement in a plunge that took up the slack, and with a sudden jerk arrested his 150 pounds. The load quivered, and from under the runners arose a crisp cracking. "Haw!" Thornton commanded. So "Gee" and "haw" are the right and the left commands. He's giving directions to rock the sled back and forth to break out the runners so that Buck can run with the sled. Buck duplicated the maneuver this time to the left. The crackling turned into a snapping and the sled pivoting, and the runners slipping and grating several inches to the side. The sled was broken out. Men were holding their breaths intensely, unconscious of the fact. "Now mush!" Thornton's command cracked out like a pistol shot. Buck threw himself forward, tightening the traces with a jarring lunge. His whole body was gathered compactly together in the tremendous effort, the muscles writhing and knotting like live things under the silky fur. His great chest was low to the ground, his head forward and down, while his feet were flying like mad, the claws scaring the hard-packed snow in parallel grooves. The sled swayed and trembled, half started forward. One of his feet slipped, and one man groaned out loud, and then the sled lurched ahead in what appeared a rapid succession of jerks, though it never really came to a dead stop again. Half an inch, 2 inches, the jerk perceptibly diminished as the sled gained momentum. He caught them up till it was moving steadily along. Men gasped and began to breathe again, unaware that for a moment they had ceased to breathe. Thornton was running behind, encouraging Buck with short, cheery words. The distance had been measured off, and as he neared the pile of firewood which marked the end of 100 yards, a cheer began to grow and grow, which burst into a roar as he passed the firewood and halted at command. Every man was tearing himself loose, even Matheson. Hats and mittens were flying in the air, men were shaking hands, it did not matter with whom, and bubbling over in a general incoherent babble. But Thornton fell on his knees beside Buck, head against head, and he was shaking him back and forth. Those who hurried up heard him cursing Buck, and he cursed him long and fervently, and soft and lovingly. "Gad, sir! Gad, sir!" sputtered the Skookum Bench King. "I'll give you 1,000 for him, sir, 1,000! 1,200, sir!" Thornton rose to his feet. His eyes were wet. The tears were streaming frankly down his cheeks. "Sir," he said to the Skookum Bench King, "no, sir. You can go to hell, sir. It's the best I can do for you, sir." Buck seized Thornton's hand in his teeth. Thornton shook him back and forth, as though animated by a common impulse. The onlookers drew back to the respectful distance, nor were they again indiscreet enough to interrupt. So because Buck loved John Thornton, Buck was able to do the impossible and accomplish this giant challenge laid to his feet. So now he's basically just made John Thornton and the other men very wealthy men at this time in history, and this is now going to enable them to do further exploring where other people have never gone before. So your two short answer questions. The sled pulling scene uses a lot of imagery. While I was reading, I noticed lots of sight, lots of sound, lots of touch. You may not necessarily get taste and smell, but you do get the other senses very strongly in here. I want you to choose 3 senses, because those 3 are definitely in there. There's touch, there's sound, there's sight. So find an example for each one of those. And tell me how he is appealing to that sense. So I need you to tell me what sense is this that he's telling us this is, and how does he show us that? I want you to use as many quotes as you need to do this. All right. So I'm thinking probably like 3. Please be sure to explain the sense and how you know based on the quote. This should also be done in paragraph form. I don't want you to just list them. We need to practice writing. We need to continue it. We're not going to have another essay. We're not going to have a huge test or anything like that at the end of this book. So I need you to really be trying when you're doing this assignment. The other question is describe 2 ways Buck has changed since the start of the novel. Be sure to explain what he was like at the beginning and explain how he's different now that he is with Thornton. If you want to explain things in between with his other people, please feel free to do it. Use character traits: loyal, brave, instinctual, whatever. All right. And explain how we know that. And you are going to use race format with as many details and quotes that you can do to fully answer this question. You should have probably more than one quote in here. All right, now that I've explained that, move on to your Schoology quiz. Please take the time that this deserves, so that if you do it right the first time, you don't have to go back and do it correctly the second time. I'm also using a 4-point basis to grade this, and I'm essentially using the essay format to grade this. So I'm looking not only for excellent details and explanation, and you're creating a claim with your topic sentence, but then you're explaining how all of these things go back to that claim. I'm looking that your work flows and that it's the format of an appropriate paragraph. And I'm also looking for spelling, grammar, punctuation. So those of you that have had issues in the past capitalizing the beginnings of sentences or the beginnings of names, please make sure you're fixing that. Otherwise, you're going to lose that point. All right. Good luck with this assignment. Please feel free to contact me if you guys have questions, but I'd really rather you try this on your own first. All right. I will see you in the next installment.